test. Hi, good morning. I can't see anyone. The lights are so bright. All right, there you are. Hey, folks, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Krstić. I head Security Engineering and Architecture, or SEER, at Apple. And I want to talk to you today about a better science and engineering of security. So I'm going to attempt to persuade you that at the leading edge, security is already strong and that there's increasing velocity of progress. And this is because security is not just improving as an engineering discipline, but it's also increasingly benefiting from a more scientific approach. So for the purposes of this talk, the distinction that I'll try to draw is that security engineering focuses on what can be built and how, while security science works to determine what defenses should be built and helps verify that they were built correctly. What this means is that the progress of modern security really relies on these two parallel pursuits. Better science, which defines more rigorous models for constructing and evaluating security, and better engineering that can overcome very severe real-world constraints to construct secure systems. Now, I'm happy to say that from my perspective, we're seeing both security science and engineering maturing as disciplines. And one key driver of that progress that I'd like to discuss today has been an unprecedented integration of offensive research deep into the defense engineering loop. And this has been accompanied by advances in tooling that really catalyze progress. So I want to share 3 stories of security progress with you today. I think they're quite different. And we'll start with Core Crypto. This is our key cryptographic library across all Apple products, from small AirPods to our biggest Macs. And it runs in all device environments, from userland and kernel to the secure enclave. So we need this library to be correct, and we need it to operate securely under a range of threat models, from malicious app execution to physical possession of the device. We also need it to be very fast to provide a good user experience and to minimize battery consumption. And we need to be able to iterate on it quickly to support new devices and new features. So we recently added Core Crypto support for ML-Chem and ML-DSA. These are new algorithms that are part of a transition to a new generation of algorithms that are secure against future quantum attacks. And they're already used in some critical use cases, from iMessage to PQTLS on the web. What's interesting is that these new algorithms are based on a different mathematical construction, something called lattices. And that's just fundamentally different than the classic crypto that we've been using before now, like elliptic curves. So the algorithm design actually makes these algorithms susceptible to potential silent implementation failures. And the cryptographic community just has a lot less experience with what can go wrong in these kinds of implementations. So to really try to achieve maximum high assurance here, we turned to formal methods. And computer-assisted proof tools and their use, this started decades ago. But in cryptography, things really turned around the mid-2010s. TLS, which of course protects the entire web, had this long, embarrassing series of vulnerabilities, if you remember Beast and Crime and Poodle. And so a new protocol version, TLS 1.3, was kicked off to try to really improve the protocol and promise to do it right this time. And as part of that, the community turned to formal methods. Now, when it comes to how we would verify some of these algorithms in Core Crypto, the challenge here is that a given cryptographic standard cannot be directly parsed by any of these tools. So the first step is actually to translate it into a high-level mathematical specification, and then we need to evaluate whether the code that's been implemented and the specification are equivalent. But given all the tight constraints that I shared on Core Crypto, it turns out there's actually no single tool that can help us do this today. Now, there are some common tools called SAW and Cryptol, and they provide a way to map the code to a low-level mathematical specification, a type of pseudocode. And this work can even be done by just skilled cryptographic developers, not people who are experts on formal methods. But by itself, this is not enough. So we actually have to turn to a different tool called Isabelle. which can prove mathematical equivalences between high-level specifications. We first manually translated the cryptol to Isabelle, and we're actually now migrating to a machine translator. And this already gave us a great result of verifying our C code, but that's not actually what's running on the devices. We use highly optimized assembly implementations, which these tools just cannot parse directly. In the end, we ended up writing a completely new tool that can prove equivalence of assembly functions to their verified C implementations. And so that lets us verify our algorithm implementation end-to-end, from the standard to the C code to our hand-tuned assembly. And the verification also covers properties like memory safety and the absence of undefined behavior. So I wanted to start with this example because it's a domain where it's so clear that stronger engineering is challenging to achieve without better science. And because it shows that tools can be powerful catalysts. They enlarge the design space, which means that they offer more opportunities for strong engineering. In our case, strong engineering means delivering these incredibly fast, tightly optimized assembly implementations with rigorously proven security guarantees. OK, no more cryptography in this talk. So I'd like to talk about next one of our very important low-level software security projects and the journey we took from the PPL to SVTM. As you know, page tables control execution, and before we had the page protection layer on our platform, an attacker with kernel read-write primitive could basically manipulate the page tables directly and then execute arbitrary unsigned code in user space. And so with the PPL, we tried to make it so that even a compromised XNU couldn't directly undermine code signing. Now, though it runs in a single privilege domain, XNU is really made up of an effectively discrete set of subsystems. And our general approach with the PPL was to protect the contents of the PMAP layer with architectural support in the hardware. It quickly became clear that while the PPL concept was sound, there were practical challenges in our implementation. And what this meant was that the PPL was now fundamentally a complex TCB with hard-to-understand boundaries, and it was using code which was originally created to share the kernel security domain and trusted it implicitly. So when we reviewed these issues, they clustered into, I would say, a comparatively small number of bug classes. Things like how virtual addresses were handled, how there was ubiquitous pointer math that was often incorrect, and how invalid state transitions were loosely permitted by checks across all of this code. So rather than incremental fixes, we kicked off a large effort between our offense and defense teams to analyze every single known PPL issue and to consider whether there is a different architecture that could entirely stop some of these bug classes. And after quite a bit of effort, we determined that a much stronger architecture is possible. So this is how we built our PPL replacement, the Secure Page Table Monitor, or SPTM. This is a clean, least privilege architecture with a massive day zero engagement from our offense and defense teams as the feature was being built. And so now the model looks like this. You have SPTM. We actually have code signing managed separately by TXM. They're both logically and architecturally distinct from XNU. And I want to highlight two mechanisms that underpin the security of this approach. In SPTM, we use a structure known as the frame table to enforce that valid state machine transitions are expressed as policy in data structures. In other words, this is inert data, not code. And so that allows these policies to be validated centrally and systematically, not as error-prone logic that's distributed throughout the code. And this concept gives us the extensibility to build other very powerful mitigations. XKR is a set of policies that can prevent private kernel memory from being mapped outside of XNU, and it also prevents multiple mappings of the same memory. So this has been very effective at protecting the kernel both from physical use after freeze and from copy on write bugs. And for tag confidentiality enforcement in MIE, which we'll talk about a little later, the frame table policies also let us protect tags from leaking. The second idea I want to highlight with SPTM was our decision to actually enlist the compiler and the C type system to help enforce some of these centrally documented security invariants. What we were able to do is wrap unsafe fields in such a way that there's a central verification function which performs all the relevant security checks and only then returns the unwrapped type to the call site. Actually, attempting in your code to reach directly into the wrapped type is just a compiler error. The compiler will reject it at compile time. With the load-bearing importance of the frame table to the overall SPTM design, we also decided to invest in formally verifying aspects of the state machine management. And that's beginning with the definitions of what valid frame type transitions really are. And it's very interesting to see that in this code base, which is relatively new, it was written very, very carefully using some of the best security methods that there are. This formal validation has already been paying off in that it's able to find some extremely subtle bugs. When you look at those bugs, they're quite remarkable because it's obvious that they would be very, very challenging for even a talented human auditor to find. So in addition to how we constructed this, we also instituted the development process where every single SPTM bug that we discover is subject to a full root cause analysis to answer these 4 questions. Every single pull request receives dedicated security review, and there's constant and rotating offense engagement throughout the entire development process. That's both for the original version of SPTM and for all future changes. So where did this get us? Well, in the end, our offense team set aside a serious amount of time to reanalyze every single known PPL issue, not to determine whether it applies directly against the SPTM, which of course you would expect the answer is no, it's a different code base, but actually to ask a much deeper question, which is, could this issue conceivably occur within the SPTM? Could it be introduced within the SPTM? The result here is that 95% of the PPL issues that we reviewed in this way are just architecturally prevented by SPTM. There is no conceivable way for them to occur. In fact, the only thing that has remained is a small set of rare logic bugs. 95% of PPL issues architecturally prevented by the SPTM design. Basically everything other than a handful of rare logic bugs. So in terms of outcomes, we've never seen SPTM exploited successfully in the wild. We've never seen it exploited through our bounty program. And just to get a sense of how this holds up to outside review, we actually also hired a 6-month independent audit by a very strong external lab, actually here in France. And they found only a single exploitable issue in those 6 months, which we had already found and fixed internally. So I think there's a story here, which is that when it comes to page management, we arrived at a strong outcome because we had a rigorous security model and development process. We had a deep integration of our offense work with our defense, and we had sophisticated formal tools to really prove the core security properties. And so with that, I'd really love to dive into MIE. We had 2 very ambitious goals for MIE. The first, to make most memory safety bugs unexploitable. The second, for the ones that remain, to make them require completely custom exploitation strategies every time that are not reusable. Now, reasoning from intuition about allocator security is almost always incorrect. So a critical piece of our early work on this was to develop a precise model of memory corruption, which we frame as follows. Given an aggressor type for which we have a bug that we want to exploit, and the target type, which we want to corrupt and type confuse, we allow the attacker to make arbitrary system calls and API calls all over the system. The attacker in this model wins if they can place the aggressor type within a chosen distance, delta, of the target type. And it turns out that this simple-sounding model is quite profound and addresses many kinds of memory corruption, including, for example, use after freeze are just a model where delta is 0. But perhaps the more profound thing about it is that it suggests that there are really only two levers that the defense has when securing allocations. One is to constrain the types, and the other is to constrain delta. Of course, we pursued both. So we introduced strong type-aware sequestering for types, and three features to try to constrain delta. First, we have a coarse allocator layout randomization, which is sort of like a more granular ASLR almost. Then we have random guard pages to make it harder to predict how close objects are going to wind up from each other in memory, even if you control the allocation order. And last, we have allocation fronts, which makes it so that new virtual memory that's being assigned to the allocator becomes type-dependent. Now, this memory corruption model also turns out to successfully model MTE, which is that MTE tags are a way to create 16 parallel views of the address space, about 2 to the 54 bytes from each other. Now, we assessed that the original MTE specification actually allowed too much flexibility for the attacker, especially with untagged memory. And so with enhanced MTE, we were able to add significant constraints. We also found it desirable to separate all the tags from each other. And so we're emulating the ARM checked pointer arithmetic, ISA, in our kernel in software, so that tagged memory can only ever affect other memory that has the exact same tag. This compounds with canonical tagging so that first-order bugs in dynamic allocations can never, for example, attack kernel globals. So in this design, it's really critical to prevent the attacker from being able to deduce correct tags. And after studying this, we saw these 4 avenues that an attacker could pursue to try and obtain correct tags. So in memory sharing, we made sure that it just cannot be used to reveal tags via the MTE ISA, and that LDG and STG will just not work. And we made it so that reading from and writing to shared memory bypass tag checking, so that it can't be used to leak tags. We applied strong memory sharing protections in the kernel and our coprocessors too. And then we carefully designed our silicon to perform speculative execution that is independent of tag values, and we validated this property both in pre-silicon and on real hardware. So this means that we're architecturally not vulnerable to timing side channels that have brought down other MTE implementations like sticky tags and tick tag. So where does this leave us? Well, it mostly left standard Spectre v1 as a potential data leaking side channel between EL0 and EL2. And we tackled this with a custom mitigation. This uses some similar ideas to TDI from VUSEC, if you're familiar with those, in that we limit linear mappings and allocations to no more than 2 gigabytes minus page size. So if you think about a sort of highly oversimplified diagram of the XNU address space, this is what it looks like. And normally, you might be able to speculate across all these different domains. But with our mitigation, because there are now 4 gigabyte gaps in between all these domains, actually really only same front speculation remains possible. We had a deeply comprehensive offensive evaluation effort on MIE, and the offensive team was part of the loop from day 0, working with our defense folks. And so that included everything that you see on this slide, but I'm really going to focus on only the bottom 2 specific areas to give you some examples for how this worked. So if you've read the MIE blog post, actually, show of hands, who's read the MIE blog post? Anyone? Yeah, okay, good. Good number of hands. So you've seen this graphic. We talked in the post about taking 6 real-world chains and attempting to rebuild them to be able to bypass MIE. And we expended very significant effort from some very sharp people trying to do this for all 6 of these chains. And we found that for these chains, it was not possible. But I want to highlight why, looking at these bottom 2 LPEs. So what's most interesting about this bug is not that MIE stops 4 out of the 6 exploitation steps. What's actually most interesting is that just stopping step 3 is enough to invalidate the entire exploit strategy. And that's because everything after step 3 is completely custom and not reusable for any other chain. And in the other bug, this one is interesting for a different reason. You'll notice that this is a stable, precise, pure logic bug. It actually has just one small memory corruption that it needs. And yet that means that it has to go head-to-head with MIE. In this case, MIE completely deterministically breaks the chain. Another area where Offense team invested very significant work was in researching ahead of time novel techniques that could resist MIE or survive MIE. And I'll share one example of this. So imagine that you start by crashing a target process, and then you spray a bunch of aggressor objects and a lot of CF objects, and you wait until the spray is cleaned up, and this leaves an imprint of the previous holes in the allocator, which means when you actually go and drop your exploit payload, you can fill the holes, and delta becomes predictable for the attacker, which means that they could sidestep some of our allocation protections. So out of that specific example, there were a few immediate conclusions, like CF objects cannot all fall into the same bucket, and Exon malloc must not create its own backing stores in bump order. But really, the main point is that because of this research, we've had a head start of a few years in finding and then disabling techniques that can survive MIE in the wild. And all of this happened before MIE ever shipped to our users. Okay, so the final findings from our offense team. They believe that with MIE, viable memory corruption strategies now are rare, that generic and reusable techniques are almost impossible, that many bug classes become outright unexploitable, and that the surviving bugs do seem to require these very fragile, completely custom corruptions every time. Which of course means that techniques will continue to be far more valuable than individual bugs, and attackers are going to be tightly constrained when it comes to memory safety. So last on MIE, I'd like to talk about some of the sort of more classical software engineering side of it, because the effort to ship MIE was a monumental engineering effort. So one thing you may not realize is that time with real hardware in hand before it ships is actually very, very limited. So getting ready for a feature like MTE has to happen almost entirely in pre-silicon. So we started our kernel readiness work with software tools, KSAN and MTE-SAN, all the way back in 2021. And then we began our userland readiness work in 2023 with Rosetta operating in ARM-to-ARM mode, which allowed us to address things like the Objective-C and language runtime issues that conflict with MTE. We also shipped PGM, or probabilistic guard malloc, in 2021. And this was the start of a 4-year project to prepare system stability for the eventual launch of MIE. So this was an incredible all-hands-on-deck effort. It spanned all of Apple. And at ship, we have about 150 processes and the kernel using MTE in iOS 26. Now, of those, 70 are in hard enforcement mode, and the rest are in what we call telemetry-only mode, which lets us actually monitor stability and then expand MTE coverage to more processes over time. I want to talk about one last pre-ship task because I thought it was interesting. It was to find all the custom allocators that exist on the system, because it turns out that with MIE, every one of those custom allocators that is not relying on the same level of protection that Exon malloc provides could end up undermining the security of MIE. Now, it turns out that in a large operating system, there are many forms of custom allocators. Just some are on this slide. And there's actually no good way to find them. If you're thinking, Why not grep? It doesn't work. If you're thinking, what if I ask an LLM? We tried that. It's 85% accurate and has way, way too many false positives. You can try to improve your prompt engineering and get it a little better, but that's still way too many false positives. Now, if you try to go the traditional ML route and train an actual classifier on this naively, you already do better. You're at about 93% accuracy, but with an operating system the size of ours, that still produces far too many false positives to actually go through. So in the end, we ended up writing a very serious, precisely tuned classifier with custom tokenization, vectorization, principled component analysis, and running it across the entire operating system. And this achieved 98.8% accuracy, letting us automatically find almost every custom allocator on the system to make sure that they maintain MIE security. We shipped it. We think it's an incredibly significant advance in protecting users, not just for Apple, but also for our industry. What this took was a strong model of memory corruption that then underpinned a 5-year engineering effort spanning all of Apple to build a solution that's always on, that's synchronous, and that doesn't sacrifice stability or performance. This is a feature that was co-designed at every step with deep integration between our offense and defense teams. And it relied at every step on sophisticated tooling long before we ever had a silicon prototype in hand. Of course, it doesn't stop all attacks. That's not possible. We know that there are still some chains that can work. I saw the announcement of lightning talks. I'm half expecting someone to show a lightning talk at this conference with a chain that works on iOS 26 to score a point. Don't be too impressed if that happens. With MIE out now, we're coming for those chains too. Here's the main thing I want to tell you. A better science and engineering of security are emerging. There's strong cause for optimism about what the progress of security looks like at the leading edge. Thank you. But while I have you, I thought I should also give you an update on Apple Security Bounty. We have paid over $35 million to over 800 researchers just since 2020. This involved multiple individual awards of $500,000 apiece. And also during that time, we ended up introducing a number of very strong security features, including lockdown mode, completely revamped, significantly upgraded security architecture in Safari, and most recently, MIE. Now, we think these advances are a very significant evolution in Apple platform security. And because they make it much harder for attackers to break the security of our devices, they also make it much harder for researchers like you, much more challenging, much more time-consuming, to build and send us exploits for vulnerabilities in our platforms and participate in our bounty. So we decided it was time to increase the rewards for great research in our program. In fact, we're significantly increasing top awards across the board in every category. App Sandbox rises to $500,000. Physical attacks rise to $500,000. Radio proximity across any radio rises to $1 million. One-click attacks rise to $1 million. And zero-click attacks go to $2 million. This is for exploit. I love that Keynote effect, by the way. So this is for an exploit chain that can achieve similar goals as sophisticated mercenary spyware attacks. It's an unprecedented amount in the industry. It's the largest payout offered by any bounty program that we're aware of. And because we have a bonus system that provides additional rewards for lockdown mode bypasses and for vulnerabilities that are discovered in beta software, researchers can actually more than double this amount with a maximum theoretical payout exceeding $5 million. So we have significantly increased rewards in areas where we want more focus. Our expanded categories cover more attack surfaces like WebKit sandbox escapes and wireless proximity exploits over any radio in the device. We're also doing something interesting that I haven't seen any other bounty program do, which is inspired by CTS. We're introducing a concept of target flags. So this is a new way for researchers to be able to objectively demonstrate their work for many of our top bounty categories. The system generates the flags at boot, and they're only available to a researcher if they actually achieve the capability that they're trying to demonstrate. So when they capture the target flag, we can programmatically verify it as part of their bounty submission. We can confirm their achievement rapidly, and we can accelerate the associated payout so that it goes into the immediate next payment cycle, even before a fix has been shipped. We think this is the most transparent way of being able to evaluate and reward some of these submissions to date, not just for our program, but for any program. The point here is that we're trying to adapt Apple Security Bounty to actually encourage top research on our most critical attack surfaces, despite the increased difficulty for researchers. This program offers now outsized rewards for findings that help us stay ahead of real-world threats. And we prioritize heavily verifiable exploits and partial and complete chains over theoretical vulnerabilities. We're launching in November. Now, if you're new to iPhone research, there must be some of you, even if you're experienced in the space, one thing to mention is that applications for our security research device program are also open right now. So you can apply through October 31st on security.apple.com to get a specially fused, research-fused iPhone. It's the latest one. It has MIE. If you're excited to poke at it, please apply. Tell us what you find. And I have one more piece of news. We're announcing a special initiative for members of civil society who may be targeted by mercenary spyware. We're going to provide 1,000 iPhone 17 devices with MIE to civil society organizations who can get them into the hands of at-risk users, because we want to make sure that our most advanced security protections can actually reach those who need them most. Thank you. OK. Last one, I promise. What's interesting about this is I did not know what Renaud was going to say in his opening before my talk. So just keep in mind that we have not coordinated on this. But I wanted to do this after the Apple logo because this is a personal note I wanted to share with you. I'll be 40 in a couple of weeks, and I've been interested in computer security in one form or another for almost the last 30 years. So that's not as long as some, but it's certainly longer than many. I learned to write my first toy exploit against a Solaris 7 machine almost 25 years ago. And it turns out that this year is the 10-year anniversary of an incredibly important paper that was published in cryptography. So Philip Rogaway is a legendary cryptographer who wrote this extraordinary paper as part of his IACR Distinguished Invited Lecture in 2015. I was going to have a QR code so you can download it, but then I figured at a security conference no one will scan it. So I'm just showing you the title. But I do hope you'll read this paper when you have a moment. And in the meantime, I want to share with you two brief quotations from the paper. Here's what Rogaway wrote. Cryptography rearranges power. It configures who can do what from what. This confers on the field an intrinsically moral dimension. I plead for a reinvention of our disciplinary culture to attend not only to puzzles and math, but also to the societal implications of our work. Later, he says, most academic cryptographers seem to think that our field is a fun, deep game, a set of puzzles involving communicating parties and notional adversaries. This vision of who we are animates a field whose work is intellectually impressive and rapidly produced, but also divorced from real-world concerns. I want to show you these two quotations again with only small changes. Offensive security research can be a tremendously powerful tool to help protect people, or it can put them in harm's way. Over the past few years, because of my job, I've gotten to work pretty closely with some of the top civil society organizations who help victims of mercenary spyware. And one thing that has done for me is I've come to appreciate a lot more viscerally that abuses of offensive capabilities don't just steal data from electronic devices. Exploits can destroy human lives. They spread feelings of fear and powerlessness. They put journalists, activists, and diplomats at grave danger, sometimes even at mortal risk. So, there's a lot of people in this room, and I want to offer you this advice. You should demand that your security work and that of your colleagues and friends makes the world a better place. And if you are not sure it does, I implore you to stop what you're doing and find work elsewhere. It's possible to do some of the best offensive security research in the world in the service of keeping people safe. You have an exceptional set of skills, and I hope you will use them to benefit humanity. Thank you for having me, Hexacon. It's been an honor.